everyone, and welcome to the Future of Work webinar series 2020, organized by the Center for Asia Leadership. My name is Faustino John Lim, and I'm pleased to present today's last episode on the power of experiments, how to help you and your company meet the future head on, with our speaker, Craig Brimhall, who is joining us from the other side of the world near Salt Lake City in Utah, United States. If you're joining us for the very first time, our organization was established at Harvard University among scholars and alumni at the Harvard Kennedy School and also the Harvard University Asia Center. We are based in Boston as well as our regional office in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. We are in the midst of a 23-week webinar series on the future of work and also the adaptive leadership, of which, and this book, Craig is actually one of the co-authors, where he has contributed a chapter. So I'd like to welcome everyone from numerous countries, from Ghana, from India, all the way to Tunisia, Thailand, and of course the US. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. You guys represent so many different industries, and we are so pleased that you are tuning in like each week to this program. So joining us again from Salt Lake City, Craig Brimhall he has his master's in education from the Harvard University. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Utah in the areas of organizational learning, change, and also decision making. He is a business instructional designer, a design thinking consultant, and also a former semi-professional baseball player. He has several experiences in design thinking and instructional design. He was also a senior research assistant at the Harvard Bach Center for Teaching and Learning. Craig, how's everything going?
Things are going pretty well on this end, considering everything that's going on in the world. Like one of my friends recently said,
how's the pandemic in Utah?
Spiraling out of control.
Oh my gosh.
And in desperate need of some quality leadership.
Okay, so, well, I hope that leadership will be coming soon, like from people like you, like just in the community, right?
Well, I'm just hoping our civic leaders are on this webinar right now. Hopefully they get something good out of it. I don't know.
I hope so. But yeah, we're looking forward to hearing from you about experimentation. I'm sure you have some stories, not only from the US, but maybe perhaps from. All right, so for today's agenda, we will have our interview / presentation with Craig, and where he will cover these 3 questions. Why is experimentation so important? Could you recommend guidelines on how to conduct meaningful experiments at our workplace? And third, how do we set up the conditions so that safe experimentation is possible in the first place? After that, we'll have an open forum Q&A where we'll cover your questions, and then we'll wrap up, and then we'll have our post-webinar survey. So, Craig, this webinar itself, we're on a 23-week journey since around April, when we had our first webinar. This webinar is an experimentation in itself, and it was a great experiment. It helped us really pivot. It helped us learn even on our operational processes as a center. So I kind of know why experimentation is important, but please, I want to hear it from you. Why is experimentation so important? Craig, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Right. Thank you, John. I'm really excited to be covering this topic tonight. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. As a scholar who studies learning, experiments are a large part of what I do every day because of what the value that they have as a process for helping us learn more about the world. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of what experiments are and how we run those, I think it's important that we contextualize these in our own lives. So as many of you are on this call or attending this webinar, you're managers, you oversee groups of people. And I'm fairly certain that the pandemic has caused quite a bit of upheaval on your team. So to just kick this off, what are some of the problems that you as managers are currently facing? And if you want to just type them into the chat window, that would be a great place to start. Some that just immediately come to mind as you're each thinking of your unique circumstances is how do we maintain social relationships with our employees, the people who we oversee, when we're no longer sharing the same office spaces? And related to that is how do we keep the morale of our employees high when pandemic fatigue sets in and we're starting to hear more about how tired people are of being socially distant and going through a new round of lockdowns? It's a lot of challenges that we're each facing as managers. Some of the others that come to mind that are not personnel related, but if you're overlooking the finances of your company, your organization, you might be wondering, how are we going to get through the next 6 months? We don't have the financial resources to weather this for 6 more months. So what are we going to do? And I mean, the list goes on, and it is unique to each of our circumstances. And as you're thinking of these problems that you're facing, I imagine that as you've thought through them, there's also been some solutions that you've thought of that maybe this will work. You're struggling with employee morale, and you might have a thought or two on how you might improve employee morale, something that you think might actually work. And this is why experimentation is so important, is it allows us to test. You can go to the next slide, Miriam. It allows us to test these hypotheses or these ideas that we have on how to answer a problem. So you might be facing the loss of productivity in your organization because people are working from home more. There's been research coming out now that shows people who are working from home, who are parents, who have kids at home, productivity has faced a steep decline. As the father of a 2-year-old, I can attest to how much productivity loss there is when a 2-year-old comes banging at your door wanting to see what you're doing. So as you're thinking through these solutions, I'm going to offer a framework for how you might use an experiment to test the validity of the idea that you have on how to address these problems. So before we get into that, I want to show at a very high level the power that experiments have on solving difficult problems. And to do so, and I write about this in the chapter that I wrote in the book, is looking at the different responses to the pandemic, especially early on, between the United States and Korea. So when the pandemic hit here in the United States, there was a strong reliance on old patterns of responses to pandemics, of lessons that we had learned from past pandemics that we had handled as a country, and a general reluctance to try anything new or to move quickly on implementing something that we were unsure about. Now, if we juxtapose the United States response to that of Korea, Korea quickly implemented new testing procedures, new ways of contact tracing, faster ways of getting people quarantined. And the way that they did it was they started each of these as experiments. So as the pandemic hit, they didn't rely heavily on old knowledge that came from past pandemics that they had faced and weathered, but they used that learning to devise new experiments on how they might respond to the current pandemic. And to go to the next slide. This is indicative of the process or the power that experiments can have in organizations, in governments, and countries. Sorry, Miriam, you go forward 2 slides. And one more. This is the current projections comparing Korea to the United States. So obviously the line that says today is today. Korea is pretty much has a flat line on daily deaths that they expect. And the United States is projected to get up to something of almost 0.7 per 100,000 citizens of the United States are expected to die every day by February of next year.
Wow.
And while 0.7 out of 100,000 might sound relatively small, when you consider the United States is a country of 300 million people, that becomes a big number pretty fast. And part of the gap between the two countries can be explained by Korea's willingness to experiment, to try out new ideas, to do it in a way that allowed them to make to tease out the causal relationships between an idea that they had and a solution, and the United States' unwillingness to try anything new around the pandemic. And as John asked, like, how are things going in Utah? Honestly, they're going terribly. We're hitting a huge spike right now, and we're not trying anything new. And unfortunately, I don't think our governor is on this call, but there's been very limited attempts at figuring out a solution using a new process, and it's mind-boggling. So if you just go back 2 slides again, I'll make my final point about why experimentation is so important. The traditional way that we think of solving a problem is we recognize the problem, say it's low motivation in employees right now, and we have a solution, an idea, so we implement the solution. And it might work, it might not work. And the problem with this is we have nothing to compare it to determine if what we implemented actually is the cause behind the change that we see after. And an experiment allows us to do not only that, to figure out if there's a causal relationship between our idea that we implement and an outcome, and it allows us to do this multiple times. So we might have multiple ideas on how to address a problem, and we can experiment with all of them. And honestly, we can do it simultaneously. We can run 6 different treatment arms, which is essentially 6 different ideas at the same time, to see which one has the effect that we're trying to get at. And this is why experimentation is so important, is it allows us to learn something about the world in a quick fashion that doesn't have to cost a lot. And in a moment, I'll talk through the ways that we can mitigate the risks of running experiments.
Oh, sorry. So, Craig, so yes, please go ahead. Just recommend some guidelines on how we can do this in our workplace.
Right. So all experiments have all effective experiments have 3 principles in common. The first is a clear target. The second is a precise plan. And a third is a quantifiable measurement. And these are important because they set the parameters of the experiment. So we need to start out with a clear target of what we're trying to achieve. The idea of, I want to increase my employees' motivation, that is a goal. I would argue that that's not a clear target. A clear target is, I want to increase my employees' productivity by 10% within the next 3 weeks, or within the next 6 months, or I want 95% attendance on Zoom calls. It is a clear articulation of what the outcome of the experiment should look like, what it should be. A precise plan is what is going to take place, what changes are going to be made in the processes. So employee motivation, what changes are you going to make to try to get to your target that you've set? And important, and this is what I mentioned earlier, is having a comparison group. So let's say you have 20 employees, right? So a precise plan is, for these 10 employees, we're going to do X. And for these 10 employees, we're going to continue to do what we did before. The great thing about that is, if you notice a change in the employees that you experimented with something new, then you can be pretty sure that the reason that the change exists or a change happened is because of your idea, because of the experiment, or because of your idea on how to improve your employees' motivation. But if you don't have that comparison group, then you lose your ability to say this caused this. And that's a very important part of experiments. So in the plan is who or what is going to receive the change, and what is that going to be compared to? And then the final piece is just how are you going to quantify the outcome? And you want to do it in such a way that it's relatively simple and straightforward to measure. So something like going back to employee motivation, saying, I want to increase my employee motivation by 25%. I don't know how to measure employee motivation. I don't know how to quantify it. A quantifiable measurement that you could use is I'm going to take a pretest and ask my employees just on a survey how motivated they feel, and then do a post-test and ask the same question. And then at least I have something quantifiable that I can compare against. And I'm going to go into an example right now that'll hopefully make this a little bit more concrete. So as you're thinking through, okay, I've got this idea on how I might improve my employees' productivity in this difficult time. And you're thinking through, okay, I've got this clear target. I've got a precise plan on how, or at least an idea of a precise plan on how am I doing. I have a measurement. Here's an example of what that looks like in a massive organization or a massive corporation like Disney. So Disney had the objective, or it's just part of its mission, to contribute to the overall sustainability of Earth, to implement environmentally friendly practices. Obviously, that's not a clear target. I don't know how you would measure something like that. However, in their hotels, they noticed that they use a massive amount of water every day to do laundry. And they thought this might be an area that we can contribute to our mission of environmentally sustainable practices. So they set a clear target. We want to try to reduce water usage from laundry in our hotels by 15%. And then they came up with a precise plan. And what that plan was we're going to give half of the guests who come to our hotels the opportunity to sign a commitment to sustainability pledge. And if they sign it, we're going to give them this pin, this Friend of the Earth pin. And part of the sustainability pledge is a request to reuse their towels. And that was it. That was the change. And so they compared the towel reusage rates of guests who received the pin to those who had not, and found that those who received the pin saved more than 25% more water than did those who did not receive the pin. And it's a small change like that. And having the comparison group is the power of experiments. We can see that this small change likely caused a decrease in water consumption by guests at a hotel. And the great thing about this experiment is it's not hard to implement corporation-wide. So Disney can roll this out at every one of their hotels with pretty minimal costs, which saves not only their bottom line in the reduced water usage, but also contributes to their mission as an environmentally sustainable company. Which goes to the final piece of this puzzle before we get to the next question is a good experiment, especially in an organization where there are risks, is to start small and keep it simple. Something as simple as a pin can have pretty drastic impacts if the experiment is run correctly.
Okay, so Craig, we're already getting some questions here from Peter Law. We'll address them a bit later. But yeah, how do we set up the conditions like in our workplace so that experimentation is possible in the first place?
Right, that's a great question. So it would be naive to think that there are not risks associated with experimenting in your organization. There definitely are risks, but steps can be taken to mitigate those risks that ensure as much as possible that the downside risk of experimentation will be far outweighed by the upside that is gained by experimenting. So the first guideline that I have is follow the 3 principles of experimentation. Set your clear target, have a precise plan on how the experiment will address that target, and then a very clearly defined quantifiable measure of how you will assess whether or not the experiment was a success or a failure. So just like Disney did with clear target of 15% decrease in water consumption by hotel guests, a plan on how they were going to run the experiment by giving half of the guests an opportunity to receive a pin if they signed a pledge committing to sustainability, and then a quantifiable measurement, which was, did they or did they not leave their towels, or did they not reuse their towels? And pretty quickly they were able to see the effect of the experiment on not only the towel reusage rates, but on the decrease in water usage across the hotel. Related to that, as I mentioned, is adhere to the principle of starting small and simple. Experiments don't need to be big and grandiose. Often the best experiments start out small, with just a small change to a subset of the organization or of the team who you manage, and see what happens, see what you can learn about the world. The silver lining of the pandemic is that the status quo of how we operate or how organizations run has been disrupted. And honestly, I don't think any of us know what the new status quo is going to be. And an experiment provides us a very clear process for learning what that new status quo might be. And maybe the new status quo is just uncertainty that we don't know. So we always need to be agile. And experiments not only can show us that there is a strong need to be agile, but also a way that we can be agile by continually running experiments to learn about the environments in which we operate, to learn about our teams and how to improve not only their productivity, but their happiness. And small and simple experiments are how we can do that without breaking the bank or running too high of risks of what happens if the experiment doesn't turn out the way that we think it might. Related to that is involving the right people. So making sure that not only do you have buy-in, if you can get it from your superiors who can green light the experiment, but also having people engaged in the experiment who want to see it succeed, because they'll be willing to put in the extra effort that it might require for the experiment, whatever the intervention is, whatever new idea you're trying to test, that it is executed as well as possible. And so you want to have a mix of people with decision-making power high up in the organization who are at least giving you tacit approval for running an experiment, but also people who are deeply committed to following through on the outcome of the experiment. And finally is to create formal policies for experimentation. So when is it acceptable to experiment and when is it not acceptable to experiment? And defining the parameters of when experimentation is okay versus when it's not will help isolate not only the outcomes of the experiment, whether or not it's success or a failure, but also the risks or the consequences of that. And 2 quick examples come to mind. The first is I had the opportunity a few years ago to run a training in the Philippines with the center, and I was working with some managers on how their teams approach failure. And there was a manager who oversees a fairly large team, I think it was a printing company in Manila, and he spoke about failure Fridays. And what these were was a specific part of every week. So Friday morning was set aside for teams to experiment, to try new ideas, new processes that they've been considering, just to see what would happen. And the only rule was that if they learned something, they had to share it. So they couldn't keep it with their team, they had to share it broadly with the organization at large. And by doing this, they made it okay to fail. But they contained the failure to just Friday mornings. And so it didn't bleed over into the day-to-day operations that the organization had to do to maintain its clients, to keep profitable, but also created the space that they needed to learn something new, to perhaps find a better process for meeting their clients' needs, finding a new stream of revenue. The positive results are nearly boundless. There just needs to be a space in which experimentation can take place without bankrupting the organization or costing you your job as a manager because you took too big of risk with an experiment. So I think those 4 guidelines will lead you to being able to experiment in a way that you don't end up looking like Beaker here from the Muppets, where you're just about to explode an entire room. Rather, if an explosion does take place, it'll be isolated. The impacts won't be felt too broadly throughout the organization. And importantly, even if you have a proverbial explosion with your experiment, say it's a dramatic failure, you've likely still learned something. So not every failure has to be a success to be useful. Failed experiments can be immensely useful in understanding how the world works, what our assumptions are, whether or not they're accurate. And so sharing that learning is another way that you can mitigate the downside risks of experimentation. If you demonstrate that even a failed experiment is going to result in a positive outcome and that we learned something about the world that we didn't know before we ran the experiment. So I would encourage you to willingly share both your successes and failures from experiments as a way to disperse the knowledge that you gained.
Yeah. So Craig, as you're speaking, I mean, I'm reminded of a statistic where, you know, the highest performing companies in the S&P 500 are ones that intentionally have design thinking and experimentation as part of their processes. I mean, it seems like these are the companies who are always on the cutting edge. You know, they have controlled, safe experiments that help them have sustaining innovations. And I think perhaps they also have ones that are more isolated, where they explore new business models or, you know, vital business models. And I think like in this type of climate we're in, where our client's psychology is constantly changing, I think the ones that, you know, do have this type of formal process of experimentation are really the ones who are going to take that leap in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems to be a hallmark of the cutting edge organizations, those who are on the vanguard of their industries, whether it's social media, manufacturing, consumer goods, is they're always testing, they're always experimenting. And John Cotter, the great management scholar, I think he's at Harvard Business School, he came and spoke to a class when I was at the School of Education, and he spoke directly to that at his international consulting firm, they have taken a small team, and subsetted it away from the rest of the organization. And their job was just to try new things, just to experiment. And they had a budget, and if they lost a budget, it didn't matter. They were just to learn new things about the world by experimenting, but they isolated them from the rest of the organization so that if and when, because there was the expectation they would fail, if and when they failed, it did not cause the rest of the organization to go down as well. It just was contained to this small team. It's just like a skunk works is the term for it. And yeah, it's a hallmark of all the great innovative organizations. And there's a myriad of, you know, the endless list of innovations that have come out of experimentation in these organizations.
Sorry, Craig, I think you still have, do you have one last slide, or should we go?
I mean, I have a final word that I'm happy to put in. So as you're thinking as managers, you know, this experimentation idea sounds great, but I'm just worried about the risk. I just don't know if we can pull it off. I don't have the time, I don't have the resources. So you may be asking yourself, what if I can't afford to experiment? And I think especially in the current climate where there's so much uncertainty and we're facing new problems that we actually don't know the solution to, and it's very likely that our old solutions are not going to be adequate. We have to come up with something new that, honestly, I don't think you can afford not to experiment.
So Craig, I think on that note, let's hear from some of our participants. So we have Peter Law, a good friend of our center, who's calling in from Malaysia. He has a couple questions that have been upvoted. So Peter Law, maybe you can briefly introduce yourself and then share your question to Craig. Go ahead.
Hi, Craig. This is Peter from Malaysia. I'm really curious with what we call experimentation is very key for improvements. So the question here is there a structured approach to reduce the trial and error? If yes, what would you suggest? Is it design thinking?
Right, Peter, that's a great question. I think that one of the key drawbacks to experimentation is this idea that experimentation is great all the time. And an experimentation that isn't learned from is a wasted experiment. It's a waste of resources. We don't experiment for the sake of experimenting. We experiment to learn. I think design thinking offers one structure for this, and one that I actually am a large proponent of. I think design thinking is an excellent framework for learning quickly about the world because of its emphasis on rapid prototyping, on quickly testing the prototypes to get feedback, adjusting the prototypes based on what was learned, and then moving forward with redesigning whatever solution it is. So I think design thinking as a framework is definitely a valuable approach to reducing this idea of trial and error for the sake of trial and error, because it gives a concrete process for what is trying to be accomplished. That being said, I don't think that design thinking is the only structure or framework that experimentation that allows for experimentation to take place in an organization. I think there's multiple other approaches to experimentation that are independent of design thinking. So for example, and this is fairly well known because they actually got in trouble for it a while back, Facebook runs A/B tests all the time on their platform. And an A/B test is, we're just going to compare this one change to this one change. And we're going to leave everything else the same. And we're just going to see what happens. And that's another great way of including experimentation or implementing experimentation in your organization. Is just these two small changes. We're going to compare what happens to the two, and we're going to do it quickly. So I think I heard somewhere they could be running 5,000 of these A/B tests simultaneously over the course of a day or over a week. The key is I think in the chapter that I wrote, I offer an alternative structure to design thinking that pulls heavily from design thinking. That essentially is set the clear target, have a precise plan for that, and have a quantifiable measurement, which can integrate into design thinking, but it's a little bit more explicit on the experimental process than I've seen in design thinking.
Okay. Peter, I think you had another question here. Do you want to share that one?
Yeah, why not? Since I am on the unmute mode already, and since we're talking about design thinking, so I just stumbled upon this a couple of months back. What is the difference between design thinking and design sprint, which is also it's a newer version? I don't know that I was told that it's actually design sprint is actually as a result of design thinking, which has been around for close to 30 years already now. So design sprint is a newer version, or what is the difference? If you may share on this, thank you.
Peter, can you speak a little bit more to what you mean by design sprint? I have an idea of what it means, but I want to make sure that I understand it.
It's just a concept that is popularly coined on the new version, or is the improved version, or it's really a new concept towards a quicker approach compared to design thinking, which is a little bit slower in that sense?
Craig, I think I can be the one to answer this. I was looking around because I actually have the book called Design Sprint. I can't find it at the moment, but it's just it's just design thinking, but like compressed into like a very more intentional process in which it gets done within like 5 days. I can recommend that book, Peter, but it's just called Design Sprint.
Right.
It's and you can get huge projects done like within 3 to 5 days.
Right.
And there's a process like from Monday to Friday. I think that's what you're referring to, Peter.
Yeah. Yes, thank
you,
John.
That's interesting.
Yeah, thank you, John. Love to get your recommendation. Thank you.
Sure.
So let me speak a little bit to that, and as well as this will speak to both design thinking and design sprint. I think there's tremendous power in working quickly to ideate solutions, to test those solutions, to iterate on those solutions, and then to ultimately implement those solutions. I don't think that that's the solution for every problem that faces our organizations, especially problems that require more time to see the outcome. So think of something that's as complex as employee morale. You could implement a change, and maybe this is where design thinking comes in, is it gives you an idea that you could then run as an experiment, but testing the outcome of an experiment or an iterated prototype on employee morale is likely going to take a lot longer than 5 days. Another example is, say you're a multinational corporation and you're looking to expand into a new market. And so you use the design thinking process to identify the products that you think might be the most successful. Then running an experiment based on the outcome of design thinking or a design sprint will allow you to see if the assumptions that you're making behind what you learned in the design thinking process hold true over a long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, there's different circumstances. I think for me, when I kind of explore these different areas of like design thinking and design sprint, it's really kind of a mindset that is the biggest takeaway for me.
Yeah, they're definitely related, right? Like design thinking is all about experimentation. They're a little bit less formal on the process than an academic would be, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be a super formal process to run an effective experiment. I honestly see that it seems like a very plausible relationship between the two. Is design thinking gives you a process for coming up with a valid idea that can then be experimented with over a longer period of time.
Okay. All right. So we have one. Thank you so much, Peter, for those questions.
Thank you, Peter.
We have another caller in. Her name is Joyce Cheng. So can we put Joyce on the line? Okay. So Joyce, please introduce yourself and share your question to Craig. Joyce, you're on mute. Hi, Joyce.
Hello. Hi.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. So I'm Joyce. I'm currently working in the more like a technical business support in an engineering role. So my question would be, let's say in this current business environment, right, whereby I was just thinking, what is the best way to convince the upper management that we could experiment a new work process, because it's not going to be it's not proven yet on whether it's going to be a successful one.
Right. Joyce, thanks for the question. I think it's incredibly relevant, especially right now. The uncertainty in the environment likely leads upper management to be more risk averse, meaning they're less likely to want to try something new even though that's exactly what they likely should be doing in an environment like this. As I mentioned earlier, experiments by definition require some level of risk. We don't know if they're going to be successful or not, because if we knew they were going to be successful, it's not an experiment. Just implement it. If you know it's going to be successful, you don't need to run an experiment. There's nothing to learn about the world if you already know it, and so an experiment doesn't fit then. The purpose of an experiment is to find out if this idea will be successful. And this can be difficult to convince management. If there's not a culture of experimentation, if there's not a culture of trying new things out, it can be more difficult than in an organization where that's commonplace. An example that's heavily cited for the reticence of management, the consequences that can have on the organization, is Blockbuster, which was the largest movie rental chain in the world. Thought streaming, so Netflix, was going to be an abject failure. They essentially laughed Netflix out of the room when Netflix proposed to, I think it was, sell their technology to Blockbuster or merge with Blockbuster or something like that, to give Blockbuster the capability to stream movies online. And rather than just run a quick experiment, they could have found out quickly, if they would have ran a small experiment, that there actually was a demand for streaming services over in-person movie rentals. They decided not to, and it wouldn't have cost them very much, especially relative to the fact that they went bankrupt and no longer exist as a viable company. I think the last Blockbuster just shut down in Alaska last year. So those are the dangers of not experimenting, and you really can't take that to your boss and be like, hey, you don't want to be the next Blockbuster, so you should let me run this experiment. What I recommend doing is starting small and keeping your proposal simple. Just say, hey, I've got this idea. It's small. I just want to try it out. It's not going to require any resources. I'm going to do it outside of my regular work hours or regular work time. And I just want to see what will happen. And I'm going to report immediately when I have an idea of what happened because of this new idea, and let you know. And that's how I would approach it, is keeping the stakes as small as possible. And then if you see some success, you're likely to start to get traction from management, because they want to innovate. They want new processes that improve employee motivation, that improve productivity, that might allow access to new segments of the market that were previously untapped. So the ability to keep it small and simple, especially at the beginning, will make it a lot easier for management to buy into an experiment that you'd like to run, or a test of a new process that you'd like to run on your own.
Yeah, I like that, Craig, like keeping it, of course, small, but as simple as possible. I think if you're sometimes, like and I think in your approach, you're making sure you're methodical about it. It's not doing it for the sake of doing it, and it's not mindlessly, but it's actually something that you test before, something you test after, and then some learning that you can actually bring to what you're already doing right now. So Elaine, we have one last question from Elaine Lai. If that's okay, Craig, we'll go ahead.
Yeah.
Elaine, let's put her on the line. Okay, Elaine, go ahead. Maybe you can introduce yourself to Craig and then share your question. Elaine, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Hi,
go ahead.
and yeah, John. My name is Elaine. I'm from Singapore. I work for Microsoft. I'm a building architect, so it's not a software architect. So I'm managing a team, and I just want to ask this question: like, how much time have you seen in successful, efficient companies or groups? How much time percentage would you advise to invest in time spent on experiments, in this context where we have to deliver work, versus optimum growth, like working towards this growth mindset and investing time in investments? Like, what would you recommend?
Right, Elaine, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I'm gonna, this isn't a cop-out answer, but it's gonna sound like it. It depends. And what I mean by that is what works for Microsoft is not going to be the same approach to experimentation that works for a clothing manufacturer or for a retail store. There's going to be different needs of the organization that have to be considered. But I think you hit on a really important distinction, is that experimentations happen and take resources away from operations, from the processes that have been tried, established by the organization as being productive, that are revenue generating. So they're the day in, day out processes of the organization that have to continue.
Mm-hmm.
So experimentation robs from that. It has to, because you're taking resources. Mm-hmm. That being said, I do think that there is an optimal mix that has to be found. And the optimal mix does not include no experimentation, nor does it include only experimentation. I think that the approach to it is some sort of designated time and space that says, on this day or on this hour, this is your space to try something new. Or once you finish this project, we're actually going to give you this experimental project, and then we're going to move you back into deliverable projects. I mean, as a manager, you have a much better feel for where your team might benefit from experimentation than any sort of prescriptive recommendation that I could give. That being said, I think, and there's research to back this up as well, by allowing experimentation or implementing experimentation into your team, not only will you gain the learning that comes from experimentation, but experimentation, almost by definition, gives a little bit more autonomy to workers, mm-hmm. which is something that has been shown to improve employee motivation. So it is plausible and even likely that by including experimentation in your team, however you best see fit, will maintain their current level of productivity and may actually increase it. And I think this is a great way to wrap up this question, is you can experiment with experimentation. Like, you can run some different experiments on what type of experimentation is best for your team, whether it's a sprint once a month, or separate projects, or like distinct teams that experiment, or like Failure Fridays, like the organization I spoke of. You can experiment with those to see which works best for you and your team.
Okay, I hope that's insightful, Elaine.
Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, so I see your question, Ezekiel, but unfortunately we're actually already running over time. If it's okay, maybe you can reach out to Craig individually, if that's okay, Craig. So Ezekiel, thank you so much for your question. Thank you, Elaine. Okay, so Craig, we have to wrap up, but just thank you so much for your insights and being so generous with your time. Before we go, here are some announcements. We do run programs for organization available in person and online. The webinar has been an opportunity for us to really pivot to the more intentionally into the online space. And we are running programs on adaptive leadership, on futures thinking, on strategic foresight, even becoming a professional thinker, and negotiation and communication. We've run nearly all of these programs for clients in Malaysia and in the Philippines, and also in China, and also Korea. So please, if these are things that interest you, please reach out to us. Please go to the next slide. And if you are interested in this book in which Craig is a co-author of, we have the Rethinking Asia series and also the Asia Leadership Institute series. Please go to asialeadership.org/publication to get your copy. And we are also running next month, just in a few weeks, the Asia Leadership Forum online, and the theme is on the world after COVID. how to lead adaptively beyond the crisis. And we will have several thought leaders, some Harvard professors, including from the Harvard School of Public Health, Harvard Kennedy School, the Harvard Extension School, where we will talk about and have conversations on adaptive leadership, on futurist thinking, on what the scenarios look like beyond the pandemic. And we also on Saturday, you will have a chance to ask them questions live. And we will also have a practitioners roundtable to kind of garner the lessons that were learned during this time as well. And also, please, lastly, connect with us. Craig has been generous to send his email. So Ezekiel, maybe you can reach out to him if that's okay. I think it's just one so far. You can also find him on LinkedIn. And please also connect with us at asialeadership.org. Also, our social media handles. You can also connect with me on my Instagram. My handle is here, and just see the work that we're doing with Craig and other teaching faculty on this area of leadership and fighting the good fight of making our organizations, our communities better. So with that, I want to thank everyone. This is actually the very last webinar of a 23-week series we did Adaptive Leaders webinar series and also the Future of Work webinar series. We are already having conversations about what webinar series we might have next year. We're speaking with some of our faculty. We are also thinking about the future of Asia, different themes within the future of work and futures thinking. And then of course, we're unfortunately next year, we're still going to be with COVID. So what are some lessons that we're continuing to learn in order to make progress in our organizations and communities? But with that, thank you so much. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure. But please do stay in touch. We have our next conference in a few weeks. And then also Craig and others are always engaged in the work that we're doing. So Craig, I'll give you the last word, if that's okay.
Great. Everyone, thank you for your participation. Thank you for your attendance. As Sean mentioned, the center has a bunch of high quality programming that's available. If you learned something interesting or piqued your curiosity, I encourage you to reach out to John and to the center. And my final word is, we don't know what's coming in the future. We don't know what the pandemic is going to bring. We don't know what the next step in the pandemic is going to be. But as managers, experiments are a process in which we can learn more about the world and learn about it quickly, the low cost that prepares us to be successful moving forward.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.